see, Tyla has a problem. You see, a while ago, Tyla was in an interview on The Breakfast Club where Charlemagne The God asked her to specify her race. Tyla's management behind the scenes asked Charlemagne not to ask that question, and the people on The Breakfast Club decided to keep that clip in the video when they uploaded it.
Can we not? Por favor.
Oh, I like that. We keeping that in the interview too.
Now, Tyla refusing to answer the question sparked outrage online, with some African Americans claiming that there's a cause for appropriation because she's using African-sounding music fused with R&B music, but doesn't want to come forward as a black person. This ended up being a diasporic war on Twitter, with some Africans making ignorant claims like African Americans are trying to gatekeep blackness, and some African Americans making ignorant claims like, this is yet another example of an African trying to appropriate African American culture. Now, Tyla went on to later release a statement on her Instagram account where she clarified that she identifies as a colored person and that she's proud of her Black Zulu ancestry as well as her Malaysian and Indian ancestry. But the statement ended up with people still being confused because a lot of people outside of South Africa feel like if you are black, then just say you're black, and if you're not black, just say you're not black. Why does it feel like you want to keep one foot in and one foot out while also marketing yourself to black people? Now see, the problem here is that the world knows how race works in America. Because mainstream media is mostly American media, everyone from Americans to non-Americans know how America works. We know how race relations work in America because of all the music and all the movies we've been watching for years. And now when we end up in a situation like this where somebody has to interact with a South African, a person that comes from a country that most people don't really know too much about, other than the fact that that's where Nelson Mandela and Elon Musk were born. This is where we end up with a culture shock. People don't really understand why we do the things we do. So in order to properly understand why Tyla identifies as a colored person, you need to understand the history of colored people and South Africa at large. Now obviously I won't go in too much depth. I'm not going to put the actual history of South Africa and colored people in this one video, because if I wanted to do that, this video would end up being 3 hours long. So I need you to understand that this is a brief history of colored people and their history in South Africa. Now, long story short, in the 1400s, the first European sailors made their way to what we know today as Cape Town, while they were sailing to India and the rest of East Asia. From that point in history going forward, it became common practice for European sailors to use Cape Town as a stopping point while they traveled to Asia. This inevitably ended up with a lot of these European sailors making a home for themselves in South Africa. Now at first things were pretty much chilled. European settlers were kind of living over there and native Africans were living over there. Every now and then they would trade, but for the most part there was peace. But then colonialism did what colonialism does. These European descendants realized the amount of money that could be made off the minerals in the South African land. This was when these European descendants started displacing native Africans to take their land, as well as started importing slaves from Central Africa, Indonesia, Malaysia, India, and other countries. These slaves would work the fields and be housemaids in the settlers' homes. As you would expect, with all these ethnicities living together, eventually they started interbreeding. White slave owners would have children with their black slaves. These black slaves would have children with the Indonesian slaves. The Indonesian slaves would have children with the Indian slaves. The Indian slaves would have children with the Malaysian slaves, and so forth. And then all these children would end up growing up to have children with each other. This process would go on for hundreds of years until eventually we ended up with these multi-ethnic people that look like this. By 1948, white settlers had established a government and introduced Apartheid, or what you would call apartheid, which was basically South Africa's equivalent of Jim Crow, legal segregation. But see, in South Africa, white people were the smallest minority amongst all racial groups. So in order to make sure that the masses don't unite and overthrow them, they had to divide and conquer. This was when the Group Areas Act was introduced, a law that dictated where specific racial groups were allowed to live and work in South Africa. But in order for this to work, you needed to categorize people into racial groups. Apartheid and Jim Crow are very similar, pretty much the same thing, but this is where they become two completely different things. Because in America, it was easy for white people to oppress black Americans for the simple fact that they were the minority, and a very small one, about 15% of the population. So whenever white people would add to the black population by having children with black people, it was never really seen as a threat in America, because at best they'd grow from 15% to maybe 18%, still small enough to oppress. Whereas in South Africa, the white minority knew that black people already outnumbered them, so adding more to the population would just make it harder for them to oppress. This is why in America the one drop rule is a thing. An ideology that says that if a person has so much as at least one black ancestor, the one drop of black blood, they could be categorized as a black person or Negro in those times. Whereas in South Africa, biracial or multi-ethnic people were categorized in their own specific racial group called colored people. And because of this, till today, South Africa has 4 major racial groups: black, white, Indian, and colored. And this matter is more complex than just assuming that colored people should just stop identifying as colored and be black instead because apartheid is ended. because for decades, colored people have been living in their own neighborhoods and creating their own culture, their own ways of speaking, and their own individual identity. This is why Tyla acknowledges her blackness and is proud of it, but also doesn't label herself as a black person. Because her whole life, she's never had to label herself as a black person. Not in South Africa, at least. And this is where the culture shock comes in. Because most black Americans assume that because their country has so much influence all over the world, most probably everything that happens in America happens the exact same ways in other countries. That means if colored is an offensive term in America, understandably people assume that it's also an offensive term in other countries. But that word has a completely different meaning and history in South Africa. Therefore, Tyla's doing nothing wrong by identifying with that word. It's her culture and she shouldn't have to change it for anyone's convenience. However, this is also where things get just a little bit tricky, because there's the old saying that when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Tyla became a big artist in Africa, then decided to expand to the West. USA, Canada, Europe, all of them. Now the discussion becomes, should Tyla call herself colored when she's in America? Should she call herself colored in a place where that term is offensive? Should she just abide by the one-drop rule? Because by American standards, that would make her a black person. Understand if anybody hearing me ask these questions immediately says, no, she doesn't have to change herself for anyone. But I'm only bringing these questions up because, yes, on one hand, she shouldn't have to change her identity for anyone's convenience. Her pride as a South African colored person should be respected by everyone. But on the other hand, when somebody walks into South Africa, I expect them to abide by South African rules, because these are the rules that this country has been operating by for years. So the argument becomes, doesn't America deserve that same level of respect? When in Rome, do as the Romans do? It's a bit of a slippery slope, and I'll let you guys decide which way is the right way. But before I end this video, I want to look at one colored person who made the successful transition into America. Let's talk about Trevor Noah. Trevor Noah was born in apartheid South Africa to a Swiss father and a Xhosa black mother. He, by South African standards, qualifies as a colored person, and he's always been regarded as a colored person by South Africans. However, when he started doing stand-up in other countries, especially the West, he started labeling himself as black. Whenever he did a stand-up in places like Europe or the USA, he would always refer to himself as a black person. And the most interesting thing about this is the fact that when he started doing this, not a single South African was offended. Not a single South African, black or colored, felt weird or judged Trevor Noah when he referred to himself as a black person whilst doing stand-up in other countries. And this is what I really need you guys to understand. A colored person in South Africa calling themselves colored doesn't mean they're ignorant to their black ancestry. Colored South Africans are aware and proud of their black African ancestry. They're just also aware and proud of their other ancestry as well. You can compare this to America, where when one person has more than one racial ancestry group, they're expected to only acknowledge the black one. Coloreds and blacks in South Africa are aware that colored is an identity that should be respected. But we're also all aware of the fact that there's a reason why they were oppressed during apartheid. There's a reason why they had to resist alongside black people in apartheid. And there's also a reason why they're still systematically oppressed today. Oppressed in the exact same ways as black South Africans. This is because of their blackness. If they didn't have any blackness in them, there would be no oppression. Black and colored people can have two different identities in South Africa, but we can also acknowledge the fact that if a white person ever woke up one day and decided to shoot black people, colored people aren't going to get half a bullet because they're half black. They're probably going to get shot just like me. In America, multi-ethnic people are immediately labeled as black. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I'm just explaining the fact that in South Africa, we have a term called colored for those types of people. And in calling someone colored, there's a recognition that yes, they are black, but there's also a recognition that they are also of other ethnicities. White, Asian, anything in between. Trevor Noah is an example of a South African colored who chose the when in Rome, do as the Romans do approach when engaging in other countries. And it seems to have worked successfully for him. He's offended no one and is seemingly enjoying a very good career. So maybe Tyla should have answered Charlemagne's question by saying, I identify as a colored person and I am proud to be a colored person, but I also acknowledge that that isn't a racial category in America. So by American standards, I guess I would qualify as black. I don't know, it's a very complex conversation, so I'm just gonna ask you, what do you think? Does Tyla have anything to apologize for? Or are Americans the ones that need to do the apologizing? Let me know in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. And if you really like this video, please subscribe. With 1,000 subscribers, I'm trying to hit 2,000 subscribers. So every amount of help counts. And thanks for watching.